So this is going to be where we start taking a look at Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement and the clear struggles that went along with it. So we begin with how Jamestown was actually started. Well, 2 years earlier, the English had signed a peace treaty with Spain, because remember, they'd been at war for a while, so they had the time and the money to spend on colonization. And they're also able to hire sailors who previously had been employed attacking the Spanish. Now it says VACO. That's Virginia Company. They're a group of investors who are, looking to plant their footprint in North America and potentially find gold. Now, if you want to set up a colony, you need what's called a charter. And that charter is more or less a written document that gives permission to set up a colony, because, keep in mind, the land known as North America was said to be the property of the king. Now, the King of France would have had something to say about that, but that's a whole nother matter. Now, the two goals in starting these colonies, you could see NA, North American colonies. You see two goals: profit for investors and propagate the Christian religion. Profit. Make money. At the end of the day, it's about the money. Now, the word propagate also means spread. There were definitely some who wanted to go so that they could have this religious component, so they really could spread their faith. But the vast majority are looking for gold, so they threw in the wording about spreading the Christian religion just to kind of appease the people who wanted that. Now they depart from England, these 3 ships with 144 men. It took 4 months to make the journey from England to what's now Jamestown. And there were several stopovers in the Caribbean along the way. Of the 104 that survived, only 38 were still alive 9 months later. So this is definitely something that is not going to be an easy task. Now, in searching for a good place to settle, the organizers settled on an island that was a bit more upriver. They called it the James River after King James, but the locals referred to it as the Powhatan River. Now, the possible threat of that Spanish invasion is going to lead them to a pretty nasty swampy covered forest that's disease-ridden. And, there were less than 24 buildings at first. And again, it was really good for defense, but you've got malaria-carrying mosquitoes that swarm in the summertime. You have shallow wells that are filled with salt water in the summer, and that's going to lead to salt poisoning. And they were also filled with some pretty nasty stuff always, like garbage and excrement. So you're going to get dysentery and typhoid fever in the summer and fall. Now, if the colonists weren't actually killed by the diseases, it made them very weak, and they couldn't cultivate or grow enough corn to get them through the winter and spring. So that's how Jamestown officially was started. Now, in terms of what it was actually like there, the settlers are going to be a mix of what are called gentlemen and more poor Englishmen. Now, you can see that the early settlers didn't really like working. And because they don't like working and thus growing and harvesting crops, it'll lead to malnutrition or a lack of food. Now, these gentlemen, they refuse to work because they're not used to doing it. They're from the upper crust of society. They would rather spend their time searching for gold. Now, you have people a bit lower socioeconomic status. They don't really have much experience with work because they're used to begging and stealing to survive back in England. And these are individuals who were kind of forcibly sent to fill out the crew of this colony. Now, this brings us to John Smith. Now, Captain Smith, and he's a military man, as is evidenced by his name, he was part of the initial settlement and had actually been scheduled to be hanged prior to landing in Jamestown, or what they called the colony of Virginia. Not necessarily certain what he did, but pretty nasty since he was given a death sentence. And obviously something happened where they decided to spare his life. He takes over the colony and he runs it military style. I mean, we are talking a military camp. Every single colonist was forced to work in the fields for 6 hours per day. And the settlers had actually assumed that the nearby Powhatan and their allies would would help them out. They would feed them. But the Powhatan didn't really have much to spare. Now, we got this image of John Smith in his official military garb, and 8 months after his arrival, he was captured by the brother of Chief Powhatan, a war chief named Opechonkono. And after being dragged to numerous locations, Chief Powhatan ritually adopted John Smith as a subordinate chief. Now, there's a lot that went into this, but, both sides misunderstood this mock execution, because officially Smith was to be executed. The records indicate that one of the favored daughters of Chief Powhatan, Pocahontas, stepped in front of Smith to save his life. Therefore, Smith was, said to now be in the tribute network. And what that means is the English were now supposed to be subordinate or underneath the Powhatan and give them things. So both sides didn't quite get what was happening here, because the English now assumed they were the equals of the Powhatan. Now, Smith is sent back to England in October 1609 to get medical care following a gunpowder wound, and he wasn't really the most popular guy to begin with, so nobody was shedding too many tears. But he left right before a starving time occurred. That's the actual name for the winter that followed. There were 500 settlers that started out in Jamestown in that winter, and only 60 were left alive by late spring. That means that 88% of the colony died. Now, an initial resupply that arrived found the devastation, and they were actually on their way back to England, but before they reached the Atlantic, 3 new resupply ships with 150 passengers arrived and said, nope, you're turning around, we're making a go of it. So the colony was saved. But a new governor arrived the next year, and he found that colonists had kind of resumed their usual practice of neglecting the fields and not having enough food. So it's really not at all looking good for these settlers within the first 3 years of founding this colony.